everyone, and welcome to lecture number 9. We're still in period 4, and we're going to briefly look at Jackson's Bank War. Now let's look at how this ties into our key concepts. We're in key concept 4.1, point Roman numeral 1, point B. All right, so this debate over federal power, we've been talking about this for quite a while and showing since the time of Thomas Jefferson and the beginning of the Constitution how there's been all these debates. Different political parties have arose. The relationship between the federal government and the states, who has more authority. They wound up getting rid of those Articles of Confederation because they thought the states had too much power and the government didn't have any. But this is continuing on now. Decades have gone on now, and they're still having these fights. And you're going to see how this ties in today as well. The Supreme Court has had certain decisions from the John Marshall Court that also asserts the federal power over state laws. And one example, and we'll talk about it a little bit today, and we've talked about it in the past, is McCulloch versus Maryland. This is where the state of Maryland tried to tax a branch of the Bank of the United States. And we had talked about that in class. Hopefully you remember that. We're also going to be looking at key concept 4.2, point Roman numeral 2, point B. Ooh, that's a lot to say. Economic specialization, right? Remember, the North is specializing in industry. The South specializes in cotton, agriculture. Eventually, you've got these national Republicans who want to promote both government and private efforts to create a unified national economy, right? Which they come to call the American system. And that's Henry Clay. He will promote the American system his entire political career. But the South isn't going to want this. And you're going to see how this is going to come into the election of 1832 now. Now, let's talk a little bit about the second bank. Now, you can pause this if you want and just take some of these notes down. Just give you an idea what the bank was and what it did. You might remember this sprang from James Madison's annual message, what became known as the Madison Platform after the War of 1812. He gave an annual message before Congress, and he thought we should do some different things after that war. And one of them was to bring back the bank. If you remember from reading that document, he talked about something that could regulate the nation's currency. And that's one of the reasons why they bring back this bank. But the bank became very powerful. Right? By the 1820s, the bank begins to act like it's a fourth branch of the government, even though it's not. It's a private institution, but it has a lot of say in the economy. And the government takes its revenue that it gets from its tariffs and excise taxes, and they deposit all of that into this bank. So the bank had a lot of money then, millions of dollars from the federal government, and that's what makes it as strong as it is. And this starts to upset a lot of people in the South, even in the West now. As the West is growing, the bus had the ability to foreclose on farms. There are a lot of people speculating out in western Tennessee and Kentucky, and even as we're starting to get ready to go across the Mississippi, the bank has a lot of say in, if you can't pay your debts and on these lands and stuff, they begin to foreclose. So they start to have a lot of enemies by the late 1820s into the 1830s, and Andrew Jackson is going to become one of them. Now, what happens is our good friend Henry Clay wants to be president again. We already talked about the first election he lost. If you remember 1824, that's the election of our favorite sons, the 4 men that ran for office, and Clay didn't even come in third place. Remember, he lost to William Crawford, who had had a stroke. He did not run in 1828. He was going to support John Quincy Adams, who loses to Jackson, and now Jackson's up for re-election in 32. Clay decides this is going to be an election for him. He's going to run against Jackson in 32, and he's going to make the American system his platform, and he's going to use the bus as a way to beat Jackson. This is his whole plan. The charter for the Bank of the United States was to be renewed in 1836. They're 20-year charters. It was chartered in 1816. Clay decided, since the economy was going so well, that he convinced Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, to go before Congress in January of 32, which is 32 is an election year, and to ask to renew the charter now, right? The economy is doing well. This is something that if Jackson opposes, Clay can use this against him in the election, saying, look, we had such a strong economy, and Jackson's going to oppose us. On the other side, what if Jackson decides, okay, let the bus go through? Then Clay can also use that against him as well, because he gets a lot of votes from the South and the West and say, look, this is a guy that you're supporting, but he likes the bank. So Clay thinks he can get Jackson either way he goes. Well, it's not going to happen that way for Clay. They're going to wind up, starts in January, Congress debates this and eventually says, okay, both houses will pass the recharter bill for the bank in 1832. It comes to Jackson's desk to be signed as law on July 4th, 1832. Now, think about that date, July 4th. That didn't go past Jackson. He knows exactly why they're putting it on his desk July 4th. It comes down to this whole thing, how Jackson thinks of himself and the government, right? Who has a right to declare laws unconstitutional? Well, we know it's only the Supreme Court, but Jackson believes he's above the Supreme Court. That McCulloch versus Maryland, where the courts ruled that states cannot tax the bank. Well, Jackson thinks all of that was unconstitutional, and so he winds up vetoing. It's a famous veto of Jackson. Now, on Tuesday, we're going to go over that veto in class. So you need to have this background information for you so you know what was going on, and we'll talk about this in more detail in class on Tuesday. But basically, by vetoing this thing, Clay thinks he now has a way to beat Jackson in this election. He goes out of his way to print that veto in various newspapers, trying to show Americans that your president lacks any intelligence when it comes to the economy. Henry Clay, I understand the economy so much better. We need this bank. Unfortunately, Clay never truly understood how much the American people just love Jackson. Just love him. And if Jackson says the bank is bad, then the bank is bad. And Clay then is bad because he's anti-Jackson. And even though they go out of their way, they have freedom and Clay slogans, Jackson forever, go the whole hog. These are just campaign slogans. And here's some things that are interesting of the election of 1832, first nomination conventions, formal party platforms. These are things I'll talk about in class. You can look that up in the textbook, though. But Jackson destroys Clay in this election. I mean, just humiliates him. And, good old Clay. Clay should have been like, well, I lost once and I've lost twice. And he should have just said, well, maybe I shouldn't be president. But guess what? Later on, in a few weeks, we're going to talk about Clay running a third time. It's just unbelievable. Now I'm going to show you this political cartoon in class as well. We're going to look at this thing in detail. It looks pretty weird, doesn't it? That's Henry Clay sewing up Jackson's mouth. Symptoms of a Locked Jaw is the name of that political cartoon. And we'll go over it in detail in class so you can understand why this was a very bizarre looking political cartoon, but a very important one. Now, the interesting thing about the whole election, remember, the bank had a charter until 1836, right? Jackson he didn't like the bank, but he didn't care about the bank either until Clay made it an election issue in 32. So Jackson vetoes the recharter bill, but the bank still had 4 years to go. And the thought is, well, in 4 years, they can come up with another charter bill, and perhaps by that time, they can get it passed. Jackson isn't going to allow that to happen. Jackson is going to decide that the bank is now a personal enemy of his, since it was part of Clay's deal, and he is going to destroy the bank in 1833. He's not going to allow it to exist to 1836 because he's Andrew Jackson, okay? He bleeds the bus to a slow death. Well, how does he do this? Well, he starts to take all the federal deposits. Remember I told you earlier, whenever the federal government made its revenue from tariffs, taxes on imports, from excise taxes, taxes on domestic products. We're talking millions of dollars. They would deposit that directly into the bank. Jackson waited until Congress was out of session, and he orders that money to come out, which, by the way, is unconstitutional. He goes through a series of Secretary of Treasuries because he brings in his Secretary of the Treasury, tells him to take the money out. He says, Jackson, that's unconstitutional. He fires him. He then establishes a new person to be Secretary of the Treasury. He tells him, take the money out of the bank. He says, that's unconstitutional. He doesn't necessarily fire that second one. He moves him to another position, and he gets a third guy in there, a guy named Roger Taney. I don't have his name up there, but write him down in a note somewhere. Roger Taney, Tanney. He's going to be very important to us later on down the road. And I'll explain to you in class why that name is going to be very important. And it's Roger Taney then, who's the third Secretary of the Treasurer, who now takes all that money out and they begin to spread it amongst the several state banks, or what they call pet banks, banks that were loyal to Jackson, and then the banks that are out west that are brand new ones, wildcat banks, because we don't know if they have the ability to even survive. Biddle, Nicholas Biddle, if you took notes from the slides before, he's the president of the bank. He tried to stop this. He threatens to call in all loans, and Jackson doesn't care. And the bank dies. The bank simply collapses. And what winds up happening by 1837 is one of the worst economic panics in that time period is about to happen because Jackson destroys this bank that regulates everything for us. And he puts all this in the hands of state banks that cannot regulate the economy. So while Jackson decided that this was a personal attack, and like I said, we'll go over his veto message in class, and you'll be able to see one of the reasons why he felt that. He also wound up putting in place the mechanisms to almost destroy the American economy. Yay, Jackson! All right. For further reading, please go to pages 313 to 314. It's not that long, on the bank war, and take some extra notes and be ready to discuss all of this in class. And remember, if you want to discuss politics with Andrew Jackson, well, I don't think I would. All right. See everybody later. Bye.